So let's set a positive motivation for our time. So I think the purpose of this course is to reflect on His Holiness's teachings on how things exist. So his explanation of the Buddha's wisdom teachings. So we can think about the need in our own lives for greater wisdom, the ways in which confusion cause problems in our lives, and develop a genuine motivation to try to learn more about uprooting that confusion, replacing it with wisdom. And we can reflect that when we have greater wisdom, we will not only be able to address our own suffering, but we'll be able to benefit those around us. We can use that wisdom to understand clearly how to actually be of benefit. So we grow in our capacity to help sentient beings by understanding more and more about the Buddha's teachings on wisdom. I would try to develop an aspiration to be of benefit by eliminating confusion in the mind and growing and deepening our wisdom mind. All right. So welcome to the second class. The first one is on the YouTube channel. If you haven't had a chance to catch up on it, it is there. This it's a reasonably long book, so 1 month wasn't going to work to cover it well. So this class is scheduled to go through the end of March. And we did actually only cover the first chapter last week, chapter 1. So, as I said, this book, the essence of this book, it's focused on the Buddha's wisdom teachings, and particularly wisdom realizing emptiness, wisdom looking beyond appearances, beyond the world of appearances, and looking at the essential or ultimate nature of things. So in chapter 2, so in chapter 1, His Holiness was helping us to identify ignorance, which is a mind that grasps at that world of appearance, assenting to just the way in which objects arise when they are cognized by an ordinary mind, which is as if they possess some intrinsic nature. And typically we would say that that nature would be related to the label that we give to an object when we cognize it. So if we were to look at a table, we would have the kind of subjective or uncritical or unanalyzed view that that table possesses the essence of being a table, that it has some concrete, independent identity as what it appears to be to us, and we don't really take responsibility for all of the active mental processes that we bring to bear on the act of cognition when we observe that object. And instead, we take kind of a shortcut and we just um, observe the label that dawns in the mind due to our culture, due to past familiarity with the object, and we kind of call it a day at that point. And um, if we look in the room that we're in, we can cognize, maybe a couple of hundred discrete um, labels that refer to objects in our visual field. And of course, objects, phenomenological objects that the Buddha is talking about, are much broader than just visual objects. There are auditory objects and objects that are purely mental in nature, um, like our conception of, um, you know, planets that we've never been to, things that we've never done, things, our imaginative experiences are also objects that when we observe them, we think, oh, it really is like that, from its own side, even though even if we've never been um, to a particular country, we have a sense of that country, and that sense might, and it's informed by pictures or what people have said to us, um, but we don't think, even if it's a purely mental object, still we think that we are noticing what is true about that thing that we've never done or that place that we've never been. And then if we do go there, maybe we certainly add to it if we engage in that behavior for the first time, or we go to that place for the first time. We have new sources of knowledge, but the view that we are only passively noticing what is exterior to the mind doesn't change. We just create that view using additional sources of information, but we still never question whether or not it's true that it is that way from its own side, independent of causes and conditions and parts and an active mental labeling or mental imputation, all of the things that we're actively bringing to our experience of that object of knowledge. So, in the first chapter, His Holiness was kind of shining a spotlight on identifying that process of concretizing everything that we observe, and how that is the problem that we are identifying. And in the second chapter, His Holiness is going to give further detail about how that kind of base process, that is, because we called that last week fundamental ignorance, or Marigpa, which is one of the three root delusions of hatred and attachment and fundamental ignorance. But really, we can say that it's below the arising of hatred and um, attachment, because it empowers the arising of hatred and attachment, and then subsequently it empowers all of the other, like jealousy and ill will and maliciousness and any of the other subsequent secondary, tertiary, etc. Afflicted states of mind. They're all equally empowered by this mistaken view that concretizes when it cognizes that cognition and concretization uh, arise together. And His Holiness points out in chapter 2 that it arises in the on the level of sensory perception, which makes it extremely challenging to identify because it co-arises even with just our sensory awarenesses of sight and taste and touch and so on. Um, but let me just briefly pause and ask if I should, if there's anything that I should clarify um, before we move on. Oh, all right.
Venerable Dondrub, I have a question.
Sure.
Is it these things arise naturally? Does it just arise naturally in our mind? The cognition is accompanied by a tendency to make it concrete, whatever we cognize.
Yeah, it's kind of just the existential condition of having an ordinary mind, because there isn't any form of ordinary existence that spontaneously is free of this. So wherever you find an ordinary sentient being, you find a being that is concretizing everything that it cognizes, whether it's an ant or a human or a hungry ghost or a hell being, um, or a long life, upper realm being. It doesn't matter the type of ordinary sense. There's differences in how their senses work, how their minds work, what their capacities are, how they, are able to cognize and so on. But whatever it is, however that does work for them, there is still a concretization that's happening on whatever level of mind you're talking about. Um, so it's just an ordinary part of mind, and it has to be actively, consciously addressed through developing a meditation practice, through and His Holiness will start to explain that a bit. But if we don't actively, intentionally create causes and conditions that act in opposition to this, it will just be maintained. It will just continue to be a part of how our mind operates. It's not, there's nothing malicious about it. There's nothing, um, you know, um, uh, evil or, but it has consequences that are uh, unpleasant. It comes with side effects that we don't want, because it blocks the capacity of the mind to achieve either lower nirvana or full enlightenment. And those are also both natural states. They're also not, there's nothing mystical or odd or mysterious about those either. You could say reality or nature permits consciousness to exist either as ordinary consciousness, which is conditioned by fundamental ignorance, or it permits consciousness to exist as in the mind of an arhat, which is a mind that has opposed fundamental ignorance, or it also permits mind to exist as a fully enlightened being, which is has gone a little bit further than the mind of an arhat and has eliminated even the imprints of afflicted states that still subtly remain in the mind of an arhat. Um, so these are all just normal, natural states of mind that can exist within reality, that can exist within nature. And the Buddha's observation simply was that given that there are kind of three options, the upper, the two spiritual ones have useful purposes, are free of suffering, are free of, are incredibly blissful, um, and so why not? Given that we still have to choose, and we're still free to choose, but why not try for something that doesn't have the negative side effects of remaining kind of ordinary? But there isn't some sort of predetermined plan, or enlightenment wasn't conceived by an intelligence, and we're not actively under the influence of some sort of malicious negative force. These are just natural options that are possible.
Well, thank you. So is it true that we could say that fundamental ignorance is a primordial state of mind? It arises naturally alongside our clear Buddha nature, which is said to be our primordial.
Yeah, because there's no teaching in Buddhism that like a fall from grace, where things were really good and then they stopped being really good because something happened. Um, the mind, it's from the Buddhist, there are different ways of conceptualizing the idea of Buddha nature, but in the Gulug presentation of Tibetan Buddhism, um, Buddha nature is presented as the changeable nature of consciousness. The fact that although fundamental ignorance and mind arise simultaneously, that fundamental ignorance is not one with the mind. It is not the same as the mind. The mind has simply the qualities of luminosity and awareness. And then fundamental ignorance is co-arising with luminosity and awareness, but or clarity and awareness, because luminosity can also be another way of talking about awareness, whereas clarity refers. So the mind lacks shape, it lacks color, it lacks form, and it develops some understanding of what it's directed toward. It develops some internal representation of what it's directed toward it, so it can generate awareness of objects of knowledge. So as long as we continue to not be successful in uprooting fundamental ignorance, then the mind and fundamental ignorance will simply continue to co-arise. And then the implication of that is simply that the options for experience that mind has are limited to, the six realms. They're limited to the ordinary states that consciousness can experience. And all of those states are conditioned by unsatisfactoriness. So, and from the Buddhist perspective, that's a choice. We have the option to do something else, and that something else is what the Buddha explained we could do, simply because he also did it. He accomplished that and then explained how he accomplished it. And if we want, we can try to replicate that process and then also achieve that result. And, we have to look at the last 2,500 years and, kind of judge that the methods that were laid down have been shown to be reliable and repeatable over that time frame. And so we develop a sense of confidence that if we put in that work to replicate those insights that the Buddha had, then we can train the mind in the exact same way and accomplish that same result. But but yeah, the Buddha was very clear that that mind has never arisen. Ordinary mind has never and can never arise free of fundamental ignorance, kind of by itself, and that there wasn't some specific thing that generated fundamental ignorance, and prior to that there was no fundamental ignorance, there was no event, or it's just uh, something that co-arises with mind itself.
Thank you. I've had that question for a long time, and that really shed light on it. Thank you very much for that.
Okay. So His Holiness in chapter 2 explains how this gets us into trouble, because it gives rise, when we observe an object, any kind of an object, again, just means anything that seems to be outside of one's body, one's mind, that we are in relation to. When we observe it, if it pleases us, if we find it enjoyable, then we have the view that the quality in it that we are finding enjoyable is something that resides intrinsically, inherently in that object. And then we exaggerate that further, and it appears, if we don't analyze, if we don't investigate, it appears as though it's almost constructed out of pleasurable feelings, constructed out of happiness. Um, like, the most, we can think of the food that we most enjoy, or activities, that we most enjoy. Every time, we look forward to it. We think, again, because what we're failing to do is recognize our what we bring to that act of cognition, that act of perception. And so when the food hits the tongue, and the sweetness, or the salty fattiness, or whatever, the combination of things that we find really enjoyable, when they come together, we kind of feel like, well, 5 minutes ago I wasn't having this experience. Only when I contacted the object did that start to happen. And then when I'm finished consuming the object, just using food as an example, then that experience ceases. So we think, well, it's the object that is responsible for that experience. Not counting, not thinking about that, our culture plays an important role in what kinds of flavors we enjoy, our own history and our own families, our own upbringing, our own experiences. If we had a, particularly traumatic experience, or a particularly joyful experience in relation to something, then we're going to relate to it through the lens of that experience. But we just think it's purely contacting the object, and therefore we think, well, I enjoy having pleasurable experiences, and so pleasurable objects are responsible for pleasurable experiences. Therefore, I need to amass pleasurable objects. The purpose of my life is to find and contact and stay in contact with pleasurable objects. Because if I don't do that, then we are afraid that we will be separated from pleasure. We'll be separated from contentment, ease, peace of mind, stress, stress relief, that things will be difficult, things will be unpleasant, things will be painful. Um, and so that's what attachment, the Buddhist idea of attachment, is this false idea that in order to be happy, I have to organize my life around consistently meeting objects of attachment and possessing objects of attachment and preventing objects of attachment from leaving my orbit, from being separated from objects of attachment. And when we are separated from objects of attachment, or when we meet objects of aversion, because aversion is just the flip side of that, where we are observing an object that we perceive to have disadvantageous qualities, painful qualities, frustrating, annoying, um, disturbing qualities. And we think that it couldn't be that I bear any responsibility for what I find disturbing, for what I find unpleasant or distasteful, and so it must actually again reside in the object itself. In this case, the object seems to be made out of something aversive, something painful, something distasteful, something disgusting, or unpleasant in one way or another. And similarly, because we want to be happy, we think that our happiness is dependent upon the extent to which we are successful in constantly being separated from aversive objects. So we have this pushing and pulling that forms the framework of how we navigate our lives. We want to pull in objects of attachment, and we want to push out objects that are aversive. Um, and when we fail at this, that gives rise to anger. So when everything is going the way that we want, and there's lots of objects of attachment, and we're really successful in possessing them, then the mind is operating out of that mode of attachment, but we generally feel, pretty satisfied with that. But when that breaks down, then frustration arises, then um, hostility, difficulty can arise. And if we pinpoint a person, that we think is responsible for that, then we direct that kind of anger and hostility and resentment toward that person. Uh, and so this is all empowered by the misapprehension of the objects of awareness themselves, how we believe that objects of attachment are made out of happiness and objects that are aversive are made out of suffering, and that we are kind of powerless but to possess objects of attachment and to remove objects that are aversive in order to regulate our happiness, and that's the only way of navigating the world. That's kind of the baseline assumption that we have when we engage in a sort of surface level materialistic approach to navigating our lives. Um, So His Holiness says we need to identify this process as well as we can to gradually develop greater and greater understanding of the sequence of events, beginning with dispassionate observation and culminating in counterproductive emotions and actions. Without ignorance, he says, counterproductive emotions are impossible. They cannot occur. Ignorance is their support. Uh, this is why, he says, this is why Nagarjuna's student, the Indian scholar Aryadeva, says, just as the capacity to feel is present throughout the body, ignorance dwells in all afflictive emotions. Therefore, all afflictive emotions are overcome through overcoming ignorance. So we talked, last week we kind of addressed this fundamental divide that you find in Buddhism, where the Buddha is quite comfortable, labeling hatred as afflictive or counterproductive, and compassion or love as productive, or beneficial, constructive, useful, and how that is a philosophical viewpoint that not everyone shares. Some people, um, you know, want to hold the view that everything is equal, all emotions are equal, but from the Buddhist perspective, the goal of Buddhist practice is actually to transcend being ordinary, to transcend actually being human, to fulfill our capacity for enlightenment. And so if you take that as your goal, then it becomes reasonable to really look at, are am I being trapped in certain ways of relating that are blocking me from that? um, because some, like we talked about the secular humanist view, which I kind of see as the counterpoint to that. And that view is kind of about sort of embracing being fully human. And they kind of have the view that you can't embrace being fully human without, that the idea is just, anger is natural, as we've said, these, it's true that almost all humans have hatred, almost all humans have attachment. So, from that perspective, of course, it is natural, it is normal. But is there something beyond what is natural, what is normal, that is better than just simply going along with what's natural, what's normal, what's typical? Do we want to aspire to only be typical, natural, normal, to be like, well, the best I can do is to manage my attachment, to manage my hatred, to stay out of prison, to try to have good relationships, but to not ask the question, can I actually eliminate from the root these disturbing attitudes? And that's the Buddhist assertion, is that we're not, we're not limited to just trying to deal with these afflicted states. These afflicted states have a specific identifiable cause, and that cause is a misapprehension of the way that the object actually exists. And that is an ignorance, that is a mistaken view. And if you replace that mistaken view with wisdom, then you eliminate all of the counterproductive consequences that holding that mistaken view previously resulted in. Just like, you know, if you have cataracts in your eyes, you could say, well, one approach is, I'm just going to kind of deal with it. I'm going to kind of figure out what kinds of treatments or what kinds of devices I can use to sort of just see as well as I can. But the other option is to actually just completely remove the cataracts, and then you have 20/20 vision, and all of the distortions that previously were part of your experience are now completely eliminated because they had a very specific cause that was a sort of um, an active layering on top of the sense data that distorted it because of a diseased state. So you can kind of think of, there are many analogies, of the afflictions to like a disease, to something that is operative in the mind, but fixable, removable from the mind. Um, and so that's the goal that Buddhists adopt is, or can adopt if they choose to, um, trying to actually not just say, okay, well, here are the consequences of this, and how do I kind of make the best of it, but rather, how do I identify the primary source and then just completely uproot that, and then I'm entirely free of all of these follow-on effects of that primary mistaken view. So in chapter 3, His Holiness does start to talk about that process of insight, developing insight. Because if the mind is presently operating from a state of ignorance, what we need to actively cultivate is an insight, is a penetrative insight that argues against that ignorance, that replaces ignorance with a wisdom mind that doesn't just continue to assent to the mistaken view of appearances, the way that things exist conventionally. He says that when you see that all troublesome emotions and indeed all problems arise from a basic misunderstanding, you will want to get rid of such ignorance. The means to accomplish this is to reflect on reasoning that reveals the superimposition of a belief in inherent existence to be totally unfounded, and then concentrate on the emptiness of inherent existence through meditation. So I'll repeat that again. When you see that all troublesome emotions and indeed all problems arise from a basic misunderstanding, you will want to get rid of such ignorance. The means to accomplish this is to reflect on reasoning that reveals the superimposition of a belief in inherent existence to be totally unfounded, and then to concentrate on the emptiness of inherent existence through meditation. So we talked about in the first class how, um, so he uses the word emptiness in that paragraph, and that's the word that is generally used to refer to this topic, the English word that's used to refer to this topic. The topic of this particular kind of wisdom that uproots fundamental ignorance, and the Tibetan word is shunyata, which is translated into English in various ways. Here as emptiness, could also be voidness, um, but typically emptiness is how it's translated. Um, and as he's pointing out, empty of what, when we say empty, what do we mean? We mean empty of inherent existence, or void of inherent existence. So we talked last week about how this wisdom is what's called a non-affirming negation. So the goal, the job, is to simply come to understand that the view, the philosophical view of inherent existence that we have internalized is a mistaken consciousness. It's a wrong view. We don't then have to say anything or assert anything about objects in place of understanding that the way in which we are understanding them presently through ignorance to exist inherently, that is not how they exist. But we then don't affirm something in its place. We don't say, oh, but they really do exist in some other way. We don't say, all we do is recognize that the concretization of the object is false, and that is something that we are actually superimposing on the object. And all we have to do is stop that superimposition. And then there isn't anything asserted about objects. So we said last week how this topic is really a critique of how sentient beings develop an understanding about objects of awareness. It doesn't really say anything about objects of awareness themselves. It's just a critique of the generation of knowledge about objects of awareness. So the critique is ordinary sentient beings, when they cognize objects, they layer on top of that object a sense of solidity, a sense of concreteness, a sense of that object having an identity, having an essence that is perceived subjectively to reside in the object and to be sort of broadcasting its essence to us as a passive observer of the object. And that is not true. That is how we think things are when we don't really analyze. But that isn't actually what's happening. That's not an accurate way of describing things. Um, and all we ultimately have to do is recognize that it isn't true. We don't then assert that some other specific thing is true, because that would really just be another form of concretizing. We can't say, oh, this isn't true, but it is, it's not a table, but it is X. It is definitely this other thing. If we did that, we would still be concretizing. So we kind of rest in a sense of groundlessness, where we confront and avert the concretization process without replacing it with something else, which is why it's understood to be what's called a non-affirming negation. We identify that we're concretizing, and we recognize the concretization process as being a mistake, as being not true, but then that's it. There's nothing that affirms some other mode of existence of objects. He says the supreme scholar practitioners of India, like Nagarjuna, Aryadeva, Chandrakirti, Dharmakirti, understood that the truth cannot be realized without seeing that we superimpose on people and things a status of solidity and permanence that is actually not there. The emptiness of that false superimposition must be understood. And to do this, they analyzed phenomena through scripture and through reasoning. He says, if someone is suffering from fright because she or he mistakenly believes that a snake is just outside the door, you would not help to point out that there is a tree on the other side of the house. Instead, you need to show the person that in fact there is no snake outside the door. In the same way, you need to understand that the very objects you imagine to exist in and of themselves do not actually exist that way. In order to get over the problems this misperception creates. So we have to, he's pointing out that we have to get really good at essentially introspective awareness, kind of breaking down the process of engaging. And of course, if you have any familiarity with the Lam Rim, the stages of the path to enlightenment, this is, of course, this topic is is really the last of those contemplations. It falls in what's called the Great Scope, and so it's the most difficult, most subtle topic that you find in Buddhism, and success at this topic does depend on mastering a variety of contemplations that you find prior to this contemplation in the Lam Rim. So it's certainly true that we're jumping, right to the end of the line with this, but it's always helpful to kind of start to get a sense of what is the actual liberating wisdom in Buddhism, because it's not the law, understanding the law of karma in and of itself is not the liberating wisdom. um, you know, Developing just a weariness of cyclic existence is not in and of itself the liberating wisdom. These are steps along the path, but it's wisdom realizing emptiness that is the specific liberating wisdom that we have to generate. But we can't skip the other insights that are also important for preparing the mind to see emptiness in this way. But again, whenever we hear the word emptiness, we need to think emptiness of what? Emptiness of inherent existence. That the object is free from, is empty of, is void of existing in the way in which it appears to my uncritical, kind of subconscious, unconscious mind. Um, uh, yeah. So then one of the logical proofs is what he gives us next, where he says you have to put together that if objects really did exist in the way that they seem to, the logical consequences would be impossible. And on this basis, you can fully appreciate that phenomena do not exist in this way. People and things may still seem to exist concretely and independently from their own side, but you will know that they do not. So here he's talking about um, kind of the frozen nature of these acts of cognition that concretizes. So when we look at a chair, the chair seems to have an essence that is unique to that specific uh, collection of causes and conditions. And it is as if, to our mind, it is as if that chair has always existed and will always exist. It's sort of as if it's frozen as being a chair, and that we can't really see it as ever having been or ever could be anything other than that. Um, but it only exists that way at this moment because of all of the coming together of a variety of causes and conditions. It used, at some point, it was, you know, a chemical here, it was a plant here, it was a tree over here. Um, and then all of those things were assembled, treated in different ways, combined, changed, shaped, heated, cooled, variety of different things done to all of those things. But then as soon as that happened, now magically, in a way, this label of chair is what dawns in the mind, and not the hundreds of different individual components and their sources and all of the causes and conditions that allowed those sources to come together. It's just this label, this idea of chair, and it's as if that's all it could be or will be. And if it really did exist like that, then that would mean that prior to the Big Bang, there was a chair hanging out, and that chair has just sort of been floating through space, and now we're observing it. And in trillions of years from now, that chair is just going to continue to be hanging out, and other sentient beings will be observing it at that time. That's kind of the solidity and the permanence that appears to the mind at the moment of cognition, and we can recognize that that's logically absurd, that it can't be like that, that things, that objects change over time, that objects can come into existence, they can come out of existence, they're changing, and then the process that allows them to disintegrate is a momentary process, that chair just left up to being exposed to hot and cold and oxygen, and in and of itself, over time, it will disintegrate. But that disintegration is happening now, moment by moment by moment, imperceptibly to our senses. You could devise a machine that could analyze the subatomic, structures and kind of document that hypothetically, but just to our human senses, it's below that. But the fact that in 500 years there will be a pile of, just sort of dust and debris is the result of 500 years of momentary shifts toward dust and debris. It isn't that in 499 years it goes from chair to dust and debris. In every moment of those 500 years, it's progressing toward dust and debris in exactly the same increments. And then, of course, if there's a fire or a storm, or then of course it becomes much more rapid, because the forces that are acting on it are momentarily much more intense. So of course things like that are at play. But even under just the bare circumstances, all objects are tending toward their dissolution, and that's part of how they exist. Um, but in the moment of cognizing, there's that sense, that uncritical, unanalyzed, untrue sense, kind of felt sense of permanence and concreteness that is in opposition to the fact that it is changing moment by moment, and that it didn't always exist. It has causes and conditions as why it exists, as how we are perceiving it at the moment of the act of cognition. But that that's that's the actual wisdom that we need to cultivate, that argues against that false sense of concreteness and that false sense of permanence. We need to actually think about things like that, to remind ourselves that the sense of permanence, the sense of concretization that we are experiencing doesn't align with the actual nature of what we're cognizing, that we are layering that on top of what's there, on top of what's present. There is an object. There is a real object, but it does not exist in the way that it appears. We give it a status, we give it a sense of concretization that is fabricated, that is purely coming from our mind. Uh, and so Buddhism would say we really can't say anything about the chair, which is why, again, why this is a non-affirming negation. We really can't say anything about it other than to recognize that how we are perceiving it can't be how it exists. It is in opposition to the things that are provably true about the object. Um, and those things that we can prove to ourselves, they eliminate that false sense of concretization. And then, like His Holiness says, we need to meditate on that realization, and that's the principle. One of the principal reasons why training in meditation is an indispensable part of the Buddhist path, because we train in focused, stable, deep levels of attention that have the power to deeply affect the mind. And this is similar to how we learn, how we're familiar with learning already. We know that if we have an important test or an important report, or that if we go into a loud, crazy environment, it's going to be really difficult to produce something from the mind that's going to be acceptable, that's going to get a good grade, or going to be what our client is looking for, because the mind is all over the place, dealing with loud music and a really busy visual field. We need to go into a quieter environment. We need to reduce distractions, and we need to focus in order to produce that good outcome, whether it's a test. And Buddhism is just pointing out the same thing, that until we can really train the mind to give rise to incredibly still, stable, calm, focused attention, these insights that we are having in meditation, they will be limited in their power to effectively argue against the tendencies and the habits that are deeply embedded in the mind right now. And that's all that this ignorance is. It's a deeply rooted habit, it's a deeply rooted tendency. But we can train in recognizing why it's not true, and recollect those true observations, those true logical proofs. And then when we combine that with meditative stability over time, then we actually have the power to replace mistaken tendencies and habits with valid tendencies and habits. And that's what the Buddhist path is fundamentally encouraging us to accomplish.
Venerable Dondrub,
Mhm.
can that, okay, let's see. If we're trying to avoid concretizing with our mind in trying to see the true nature of reality, the emptiness, um, can that lead to another form of, can it lead to a tendency toward another form of ignorance, and that is nihilism, where you start thinking, well, it's all headed toward dissolution anyway, everything. And
Mhm.
so, why bother, Do you know what
Mhm.
I mean?
Yeah, so there is a danger. Of course, the what the great masters would say is that the danger toward, so the two extremes are nihilism and eternalism. Eternalism is that concretized, permanent, view that we already have. Um, but of course, there is a danger of what they would say negating too much, going beyond. So that's why what we're meant to do is just notice how the mind is exaggerating, how the mind is adding on top of what's there. So we don't say that there is nothing that exists. We don't say that it's all, that there's some sort of grand, there are analogies where they say to think of things as like an illusion, or as, as illusion like, or as a mirage, or, there's analogies that kind of get at that point, because when you, my understanding is that when you directly perceive, it is it is as if things kind of barely exist, that they exist, but the way in which they appear to the mind is so different than how they appear now, that it's like things exist but they sort of barely exist. um, but they don't not exist. It isn't like there's some, machine that we're all hooked up to, where we're being, just completely fed totally false thing, and that we're just going to die, and then there's just nothing. And so the mind exists. The mind is a genuine phenomena that exists, and it its function is right now to associate with form. And because mind is ordinary, the forms that it can associate with are ordinary. And as we've said, ordinary forms are characterized by unsatisfactory experiences. So that's existentially just not great. But the mind can exist in a state of perfect peace, perfect clarity, perfect awareness, perfect, um, bliss and love and enjoyment and compassion, and all of these incredibly still, peaceful, blissful states that suffuse the mind when mind is free from the afflicted states. Um, so it would be a mistake to think that there's no point to this kind of analysis, or that this analysis would lead to a view where there are no, where there are no meaningful consequences, that it's just, um, that it's all just dust, and, you know, and then that's it. Because the mind is empty of inherent existence, but the mind is a phenomena that does exist, and it will experience, um, reality. It will continue to exist as something that experiences, as something that is aware. And that awareness can either be conditioned by afflicted states or not. Um, so, what we're doing is then just liberating ourselves from afflicted states. Um, but we don't go so far as to say that because things don't exist in the way that they appear to a wrong consciousness, then that means that they don't exist at all.
Thank you.
So then His Holiness, kind of addresses this point when he says, when ignorance is overcome, you will have uprooted the mistaken beliefs that superimpose on objects qualities such as beauty and ugliness beyond what they actually have. Then all other afflictive emotions, lust, hatred, jealousy, belligerence, and so on, that have ignorance as their root, are overcome. When afflictive emotions are removed, they can no longer motivate your actions, which lead to karmic formations, and then your powerless rebirth, birth and rebirth in cyclic existence, driven by predispositions established by your actions, are overcome. So that's a subtler point about how ignorance corresponds, and this is the workshop on Saturday that Andy's doing is kind of on this point, the relationship between fundamental ignorance and the process of rebirth, how a mind that is under the influence of afflictive emotions empowered by ignorance creates the causes, the karmic causes and conditions that lead to additional ordinary rebirths. So again, it's not a moralistic framework. It's not like saying we're bad people, but it's just saying that ordinary mind can only give rise to more ordinary mind. That, when ignorance, that what's driving the engine of rebirth is ignorance, and what drives the engine of enlightenment is wisdom. So when we replace ignorance with wisdom, then we've created the karmic, well, not the karmic, because there's no more karma at that point, but we've eliminated the karmic causes of ordinary rebirth, and therefore enlightened mind will manifest, and the enlightened experience will manifest. But again, that's what the workshop on Saturday is about, and that will be recorded if you have to miss it. But that's on the what are called the 12 links of interdependent uh, origination. So okay, do we have any other thoughts or questions?
Well, I just have to say, I think I'm finally starting to understand emptiness. It takes such a long time. And it just takes, it's ongoing. Yeah.
So in chapter 4, then, His Holiness, chapter 4 is called Feeling the Impact of Interrelatedness. So he says, if the mistaken view that people and things exist independently is the cause of all other counterproductive views and emotions, then one of the principal means of overcoming this mistaken outlook is to reflect on the fact that all phenomena arise dependently. Where there is long, there has to be short. They do not exist through their own nature. This relativity is why Buddhists say that all phenomena are dependent arisings rather than independent arisings. So this is again, kind of directly confronting that sense of concreteness and permanence that we ascribe to phenomena by thinking, okay, well, I look at a chair and I just see, all I can see is, chair. And I can't think of it in any other way, but I'm looking at something that has four legs, and it has two kind of side supports, and it has a back support, and it has a flat surface where you can sit. Um, but I'm also seeing the color blue, I'm seeing the color brown, I'm seeing a surface that is reflecting the light in a way that looks like a vinyl or a plastic, and another way that looks like kind of absorbing the light more in a way that a wood, which is less reflective. So I'm seeing different textures. I'm seeing different, um, you know, um, uh, materials that are used. And so, and I can recognize that it has a top, so right now I'm looking at the front view of the chair. I can infer that there's a back to the chair. Previously, earlier in the day, I was looking at it from a different angle and I saw that there was a back, but I would also kind of even if I was going into the room for the first time from the front, I would still infer that there was a back to the chair, that there's parts of it that I'm not seeing, but that are part of the chair. Um, and so what would happen if I, cut one of the legs off the chair, and then it kind of fell forward a bit? Well, now I would say it's a it's not really serving the purpose of being a chair. Can't really sit in it anymore. You'd kind of fall over. Um, what would happen if I removed the right support for the chair, the right kind of armrest for the chair? Well, you could still sit in it, but you'd kind of have to be mindful of not leaning in a particular way. You'd have to lean in a different way. Again, if I took the back and both supports off, I just have a flat surface. Is that a chair still? We might call that a stool. Now, we're not calling it a chair, we're calling it a stool, because a stool is a flat bottomed seating device that doesn't have a back, it doesn't have sides. It's just simply a circular, or but a flat bottomed seating device. Um, when we add a back, when we add sides, suddenly now we've turned a stool into a chair. Um, and so recognizing that you can do, you can kind of play these mental games with it, and you can think of it like, what would happen if I did this? What would happen if I added this or removed this? Or change this, and recognizing, well, it looks like it's one thing. It looks like when I apprehend chair, I'm just apprehending a concept, and but that chair has four legs. It could have six legs, it could have eight legs, it could have three legs, maybe it could have two kind of, um, like a front sort of, not leg, but those sort of square um, things. I don't know what you call that, but it could have a front and a back kind of brace, a front brace and a back brace, so that it could still be upright. It would still function as a chair under all of those different conditions. Um, but regardless of which iteration it was, I would still regard it as a chair, because chair is a label for a class of objects, just like a dog is a label for a pug and a beagle and a Rottweiler, and a, you know, whatever it. Then they're very different. But they all have four legs, or they all have fur. They're not cats. They're not elephants. Um, but it's a class where things are similar enough that they fit into the class, and different enough that they're excluded from other classes. Because a stool and a chair are both devices that you sit on, but stools and chairs are different enough that we give them their own categories. And you can't properly call a stool a chair, and you can't properly call a chair a stool. Just like dogs and cats are both animals, but you couldn't look at a dog and say, properly. People would disagree with you, conventionally speaking. If you were to look at a dog and say that it's a cat, everyone else would say, well, no, that's not accurate. Um, so these are categories that we have just come up with in language and in culture, based on kind of arbitrary distinctions, and similarities and differences. But you can recognize then that a stool, in order for me to call it a stool, it has to be free from a back and sides. In order for me to call it a chair, it has to have some sort of back, and it probably has to have some sort of armrests or something. Maybe not, but at least it has to have a back of some sort. Um, and therefore, the fact that I relate to it as a chair depends entirely on the fact that there is a back. Um, just like the fact that I call a giraffe depends entirely upon the fact that it has, a really long neck, and it has has legs of a certain length, and it has a particular coloration. And if it had the characteristics of a elephant, I would have to call it an elephant. Um, and so it is the characteristics, the coming together of those characteristics, that require me to use a particular label. And if those characteristics change, then the label that I have to use change, which argues against that momentary sense of permanence and solidity that appears to the mind when the label is there, because it is as if the label can own all of the parts. It is as if the label can own the causes and conditions that gave rise, like the chemicals that were used, the paint that was used. The label of chair seems like it's capable of being the owner of the color of the chair, of the materials of the chair, of the chemicals and processes that were used to give rise to those elements and parts of the chair. Um, and so, but what's, and so when we recognize that it is the causes and the conditions and the parts, and then the act of labeling, the kind of cultural, social, um, act of finding what to call it, and what is it, what is it, and then how that colors how I relate to it. Because in our culture, we call things that look like that a chair. Now we know what to do with it. Now we know that, oh, we just go into the room and we don't try to sit on the tables, because we know that tables are for putting your books on, for putting your laptop on. We know that we're supposed to sit in the chairs because we've just assented to that as a society. We could live in a different society with different rules, and we might use the chairs to put our books on, and we might sit on the tables. But we haven't agreed to that in our society. We've learned to sit in chairs and to put our books on tables, and that's part of this dependent arising. We understand how to interact with things because of what we've been taught, because of that's one of the lenses that we use to construct the appearance of the object, is what our society, what our culture, what our family has told us we ought to do with them. And that's kind of how society is able to function well, is because we all have agreed to do things in a similar way, and we all kind of know how it all fits together. But that's just culture. That's just shared, agreed upon, conventional reality. It has a lot to do with how human senses work. If our senses worked differently, we would construct our environment in a different way. Um, and we construct things. Most people can walk, and so we construct stairs. But we also have to then construct ramps for people who can't walk. And if we don't, then that's a problem for. And most people are sighted, so we construct things in a way that is heavily dependent upon the use of our eyes. But not everyone is sighted, and so that causes obstacles. We could construct an auditory society where the cues for what to do and how to, that they would be auditorily based. But sight is such a dominant way that most people perceive, that we've chosen to construct society mainly through that lens. But that creates obstacles when that is unavailable. But that's just a choice. It's a cultural choice that we've made. Um, so we can begin to be to appreciate the fact that objects do have causes and conditions, that they do have parts, and that when we discount those causes and those conditions and those parts in favor of just the label that dawns in the mind, then it is as if we're saying it's an independent arising, that it just magically appears in front of us as its label, when in fact it is a dependent arising. Its appearance is entirely constructed on the basis of causes and conditions, on parts, and on that act, that active mental act of imputing a label or designating a label, calling it a chair, calling it a table, calling it an elephant, calling it an airplane. That active mental imputation or designation, where we've said, okay, we're just agreeing as a society that things that are similar in this way and consistently dissimilar in these ways are going to fall into this class. And these other things that have these similarities and these dissimilarities, they fall into a separate class. When it's entirely arbitrary. There's nothing from the side of the object that's giving rise to that. We're just deciding that that's how we're going to create a society that works in a particular way. You take that object to a different society that's been isolated, they won't have that history with that object, and they won't know what to do with it. They won't be able to interact with it in the same way that you do, because they don't share your history, your cultural relationship with that object. They haven't actively constructed it in the way that you're constructing it. And so their relationship will be different. Um, which is why, when they gave, we do these things where, we we think that if we give malaria nets and things, without educating them about what to do, like they used them for fishing because they were like, we need fishing nets, right? Like we fish, and so they thought they were giving them fishing nets, and then the waters got polluted with the chemicals that were on the malaria nets because there was a lack of, they didn't tell people how to relate in the same way. They thought they were fishing nets. Because that's what they had in their culture that looked like what they were being given, and that's how they related to them completely reasonably. Um, so, what we can see, if a malaria net was a malaria net, because when we see, we look at the bag and it says malaria net, and so we think, oh, well, yes, it is from its own side, it is a malaria net. And so we think that's the only way you can relate to it. And if that's true, then it, first of all, it couldn't be used to catch fish because it can only be what it seems like it is. It but it could only serve that. But you can in fact catch fish with it. It may not be the best choice because again, there's chemicals on it and so on. It might be not a good idea, but you can do it. Just like you can use a chair to hold your laptop, and you could sit on the floor or you could kneel or what, you can do that. It can serve that purpose. um, so when we start to take responsibility for all of the things that we're bringing to the act of cognition, then we begin to argue against just the appearance that's arising in the mind, that's telling us that there's only one way of thinking about that object, that it is as if that object is showing us what it is. That's a mistaken way of thinking about it. We are actively constructing how we think about that object. And then on the basis of that, like His Holiness was saying, if it's pleasant, we're never going to want to be separated from it because we think that the object is inherently pleasant. If it's unpleasant, we can't tolerate being in contact with it because we think the object is inherently unpleasant. And that gives rise to all kinds of conflict, all kinds of disturbing attitudes, conflict with other people, um, and it drives all of our actions from morning until night. We are driven to bring in pleasant objects and push out unpleasant objects because we don't take the time to argue against the false perspective that the object itself is pleasant or unpleasant. And then there's a deeper, His Holiness points out that we also have to think about that our own identity is an object that we're cognizing, just like we're cognizing a chair, just like we're cognizing chocolate cake. We also cognize our identity, and we also concretize our identity. And that's actually the most impactful way that this ignorance operates. We're not only cognizing tables and chairs and foods, and it's not just other people too, but we're cognizing the way that we relate to ourselves, and we're holding that identity in this same permanent, stable, unchanging, concretized way. And then these objects of pleasantness or unpleasantness, they're being held by a self that's similarly concretized. And then there's all kinds of friction in the mind and no spaciousness, no capacity for change, no, because everything is so tight and so solid. Um, so when someone says an unkind thing to us, it is as if that unkind thing hits this solid, real, independent me, rather than thinking of the self as also causes and conditions, parts, and an act of mental imputation. If we could hold the self in that looser, softer way, then we would suffer less. And ultimately, we wouldn't suffer at all once we directly saw that with deep meditative skill and concentration. So of all of the objects that we're concretizing, we are concretizing all objects, but of all of those objects, it's really the self that's the most important to recognize this mistaken process is happening to. And again, that's also something that, on the workshop, that, this, because it relates to karma and all of these things, that but that's how we ultimately, by applying this analysis to the concretization of the self, that's ultimately the best way to liberate ourselves from suffering. But we've just run out of time, unfortunately. Are there any questions, thoughts?
When is this workshop?
Saturday. It's the same day as this class, but it's from 10 to 4 on Saturday
Today's
with a
not Saturday?
2-hour lunch break.
I thought today was Saturday.
Saturday the 18th.
Oh, the 18th, I'm sorry. So, yeah, that sounds good. I want to sign up for that. Thank you.
Any other questions? All right. Well, thanks for coming. So, as we do at the end of our classes, we set a positive motivation at the beginning, and at the end of the class, we do what's called dedication. So that's just when we think about the positive energy that we've created. Karmically, that positive energy ripens in a positive way. So we think about the most beneficial ways that we would like it to ripen. We think about that karmic ripening as being incredibly vast, incredibly profound, incredibly beneficial, and thinking of it ripening for countless sentient beings. So just on your own, try to think about how that karma, positive karma that you've created, will ripen, and try to direct it and visualize it ripening in really vast and profound ways. All right. So we will carry on next week. Thanks for coming.